Hello everybody, Paul Sheriff here with Pluralsight. This module is Avoid Hard Coding in Unit Tests. Our goals for this module are to learn how to use constants, use a configuration file, basically help keep our unit tests as self-contained as possible. In addition, we're going to take a look at the test context property, which we'll use in many of the later modules. There are many best practices we use when we're coding regular classes and methods, and there's the same ones that we use basically in doing unit tests as well. So don't hard code things, use constants wherever you can, maybe store data in a configuration file, set up and tear down as close to each unit test as possible, use comments, and use good variable and method names. Let's take a look at using constants. Let's go and remove this hard-coded file name right here. So let's cut that out. And we'll come up to the top of our class and let's just add a private constant string called bad_filename, and let's set it equal to that value. So this is just like you would do in regular coding, right? I mean, even though you're in a unit test, you still want to apply the best practices. So take advantage of constants whenever you can. We're going to do something different with this one in our next sample. Another way to avoid hard coding is to add a configuration file. So you just simply add an app.config to your unit test project, add an app settings element, set a field from that config file in your class, your unit test class, and then use that field like in the file does exist test. Write code to create the file on the fly, and then write code to remove the file. That way you don't have to use one that I was using like C:\Windows regedit, right? That is hard coded to that particular Windows system. We're going to actually create one now on the fly by grabbing some file information from a config file. Inside of the app.config file, simply add an app settings element, add a key, we'll call it good file name, and add a value. Now I'm going to use a replaceable token. I just made this up, called app path, and then add the file name. We're going to do that so we can keep it generic for on whatever system the unit test is running. We're then going to create a method here called setGoodFileName. What you'll do is you'll grab, using configurationmanager.appSettings, you'll grab the value of the good file name and put that into a private field in our unit test class. Check to see if that app path token is in there, and if it is, we'll go ahead and replace that with the environment.getFolder path, and we'll just use application data. So that way we have a real path, but it's based on whichever system is running the unit test. That way nothing is hard coded here. Once we have that method written, we can call it from our filename_doesExist method, and we'll then create the good file name, just putting some text in, perform our file exists method, and then go ahead and delete the file when we're done. This way, the file name does exist test, hey, this thing is totally self-contained. It grabs the file name, creates it for that environment, creates the file, tests for the file, and then deletes the file. So again, just a nice, kind of progression here of a good, setup and tear down. All right, let's take a look at using a configuration file. Over on your unit test project, right mouse click, add new item. Let's go ahead and just find a configuration file, application configuration file, add. And inside, let's go ahead and add an app settings section. Add a key called good file name, and the value then is going to be just like we put into our slide. We're going to use app path / and then we'll just do testfile.txt. You can call it whatever you want, of course. In our file process test, since we're going to have to read from this, we want to use system.configuration. One thing you should always test is make sure that inside of your references you do have the system.configuration DLL. So go ahead and add that now. There it is. Click OK. So we can now take advantage of using that system configuration. The last thing we're going to do here is create a private string, and this one will just be simply good file name, and that's where we're going to grab the value from the config file and put it into this variable here. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and just add a method. We can add it anywhere, and we're going to create a method called setGoodFileName. Now I've already got it written, so I'm just going to go ahead and drag it over here. So this one here is setGoodFileName. And this uses, as you can see here, the configuration manager.appSettings to grab that key value that we put in there and place the returned value into GoodFileName. Then checks to see if it contains that token, app path, and then simply replaces that with the application data folder. So at the time that this runs, it will then have a fully qualified path and file name in it. Now do notice that this is just a regular method here. You can have regular methods in addition to test methods. These are methods that won't ever be run directly by the unit test framework like your other test methods, but can be used as support to be called from your other unit tests, such as the file name does exist method you see here. Now that we have that new method, we can call it. What that does is then sets the good file name. So what we want to do is we want to actually create this by using the file class. So we need to bring in the using for system.io, file.append all text into the good file name, some text. So that creates a file. Then at the end, let's go ahead and do a file.delete on that good file name, like so. Let's go ahead and debug this so we can watch the process happen. I'm going to go ahead and do a debug tests. Okay, we can turn off some of these other windows here so we can see more of the screen. So we're going to walk into the set good file name. So it retrieves that value from the config file. Does it contain the app path? Yes, it does. So we go ahead and now we have the full path and file name that we want to create. So we can go ahead and create the file. We can then test for its existence. And this is where we now need to use, instead of the hard-coded value, right, the underscore good file name that we created. Okay. And then delete it when we're done. And hopefully everything works as we planned. And it did. There we go. The test passes. So there we go. We've removed now the hard coding from our unit tests. Now you might not use all of the options in the same test project. You might just use constants, or you might just use the config file. However, there's nothing wrong with a combination of both. It's your choice. There's another property we can add to our test classes called test context. And we create the test context in all our test classes because we typically want to have it there. This is automatically created by the unit test framework, and it's set then before each test is run. It's useful for accessing test information and also very useful in data-driven tests, which again lends itself towards eliminating hard coding. And we're going to see more of the test context property in the later modules. But there are some useful properties like data connection and data row. We use these in the data-driven testing. Deployment directory is also very useful, and I'm going to show you a good example of that later. And test name, we can actually see what test name is being run at this time. And so that is another property we'll take a look at. There are also some useful methods. Maybe you want to begin a timer and end a timer to see how long a certain process takes. And of course then a write line so you can actually write some output into the test results log. Let's take a look at adding a test context property to your unit test classes. Let's add to the file process test a new property that's of the type test context, and the name is test context as well. I know, a little confusing, but it has to be that. That's what the unit test framework looks for when they're going to create their instance of this test context and pass it into your property. Now we're going to take a look at some other uses of it a little bit later in this course, but for now we can just do a write line. We can say creating the file and then add on the good file name, like so. We can then just say testing the file, and then we can say deleting the file. So we'll add a few things here. Now, we're going to go ahead and run this. However, I'm using Visual Studio 2017 here, and I think I hit debug, so that's fine. Either way works. Now, when this is kind of early in 2017, and there's a bug right now in 2017. So normally you would click on the test that you just had the test context.writeLine in, and right down here there'd be a little output link. You'd click on it and another window would appear and show you the output of creating the file, testing the file, and deleting the file. There is a bug right now in Visual Studio 2017, but if you're using 2010, 13, 17, or 15, that will show up, and probably by the time you're watching this video, they'll have fixed this bug in Visual Studio 2017, and it should work for you. So again, there'll be a little hyperlink down here. Now this is very useful, kind of like what you might do with a debug.writeLine. You know, you use it for debugging things, or just, for me, it's nice to have some extra confirmation of what happened in the test. This will be put into the results file, so it's actually logged. For instance, when you're logging with a command line, you will see these values appear. In this module, we took a look at using good programming practices in our unit tests, just like you do in your normal programming. We use constants. We might use a config file. We might create a test context property to help us write line and do some other things as well. Now, coming up in the next module, we're going to talk about initialization and cleanup methods that you can add to your unit test classes.